Hey everybody, welcome back to Men Need to Be Heard. It's Dan, and have I got a treat for you? This is one I've been waiting to do for a while. This is someone that I started following on TikTok, I believe it was like 3 years ago now, and we're going to get into why. And he is a hoot, and I consider him a brother from another mother, even though we're just meeting each other. Let me bring him on. So let me introduce my brand new friend. You may know him as Officer Nate. Hello, Nate.
How you doing, Dan?
I am doing fantastic. So as I said, I've been
Good.
following you for a while. Going back,
Which I appreciate.
well, you've had a few accounts, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit too. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll dive into that a little bit. So for those that don't know, you may know Nate as I call him the LeBron guy, and we're going to dive into that in a little bit because he went viral not just on TikTok, but I think you went worldwide with that. But before we get into that, share with us, if you will, Nate. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and that kind of stuff.
Sure. Nate Sylvester is my actual name. Born and raised in Twin Falls, Idaho. I've got a daughter. She just turned 18 this year, graduated high school, last year. Law enforcement for 13 years with the Twin Falls Police Department, and then about a 6-month stint with the Bellevue Marshal's Office, which kind of ties into the whole LeBron thing, which I think we'll get into. Criminal justice degree, bachelor's degree in criminal justice. I'm actually going to go to law school next year. Not very many people know that, but I'm sure a few more people will after doing this interview. But that's been an aspiration of mine for quite a while. I mean, since the LeBron thing, the LeBron video, my life kind of, I want to say it took a left turn, but actually took a right turn because a lot of great opportunities sort of presented themselves as a result. I published a book a couple of years ago called Never Off Duty. Started my own podcast, the Officer Nate Podcast, which you can find on Apple and Spotify. Started a business with some friends down in Utah. It's actually a chiropractic and wellness clinic. Has nothing to do with law enforcement or any of my social media content, but it was a great opportunity to get in on the ground floor. And I mean, other than that, I spend my days, focused on those things. And, the podcast, also have a nonprofit organization called the Blue Lives Foundation that benefits police officers and their families.
I've heard you talk about that before, and thank you for doing that. And by the way, thank you for your service.
I appreciate it.
And I said he was the brother from another mother because I used to do wellness. I was a personal trainer for 40 years. People that follow the show know that. I actually divested myself of my gym this past summer. So I'm not fully retired from it because I still have people I train online. But
nice.
Yeah, it's... I find that people who do things like law enforcement and wellness, it's in our blood, right? To help other people. That's one of the things I find intriguing about the content that you do, primarily on TikTok, but like you said, with the podcast and all that is, I think you're very much like me in that our goal is really to kind of help people and educate and let them see the other side, so to speak.
Yeah.
I guess let me just kind of dive into, because where it lead me to that was talking about the LeBron thing. You're smiling because the reason I want to bring it up is because that's how you became known. It did affect your life, as you said. For those that have not seen it, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes. So if you haven't seen it, I'll find it somewhere on the line and post
It's actually pinned to the very top of my Instagram account, and I can give you the link for that.
You know what? Once I get the link, we'll post it down in the show notes because you have to see it. I got to say, it's top 3 videos I've ever seen because it was just brilliant. And I'm not saying that because you're sitting here. I probably have watched that video, no joke, 50 times at least, because I die laughing every single time. But can you kind of talk about the video and more from why did you do it? And then, of course, what you're talking about in it.
Yeah. Well, just like anybody else, or a lot of people, I should say, back in 2020, when we were in the midst of COVID and the lockdowns, I downloaded TikTok just as a form of entertainment. My daughter and I would send each other funny videos back and forth, and that was the only reason I really had it. But then when I went to work for the Bellevue Marshal's Office in December of 2020, I noticed that there was kind of a niche for the cops of TikTok. And I thought, well, this is something I can do. I mean, Bellevue is a very small town, and we weren't incredibly busy, so I had a lot of downtime. And during my breaks, I would, post videos in my uniform, satirical videos, just me being goofy, trying to humanize the badge and, trying to make cops more relatable to the general public. And they were really popular. I had started to amass quite a following. And then, let's see, in April of 2021, Officer Nicholas Reardon with the Columbus Police Department shot and killed Micaiah Bryant, and that was a national issue. There was a lot of controversy surrounding it, and that was at a point where race relations were just so tense, and there was a lot of friction there. And after that had happened, LeBron James tweeted out a photo of that police officer with the caption that said, "You're next, #accountability." And that pissed off a lot of people, especially police officers, people in the law enforcement community. And I'd seen sort of a trend of officers on TikTok posting videos where they're making fun of him, they're mocking him, calling out his ignorance, on the subject. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna do my own video. I'm gonna try and make it funny, but also make a point at the same time. And so the video that you've seen 50 times that so many other people have seen was the product of that. And I posted that. And again, I'm in my uniform, but what a lot of people sort of are unclear about is that I was off duty at the time. I had just finished my shift. I was off duty, made the video off duty, posted it off duty. And that was on a Saturday morning. And by Sunday, I was getting phone calls and text messages, and people are like, dude, what is it? Like, you're on the news. What's going on? What's this video that you made? And I had no idea, because I was actually traveling to Utah at the time. And I wasn't watching the news. I wasn't really checking my phone all that much. And so then I went and looked at my video, and it had millions of views already. People are sending me links to Newsweek articles and Gateway Pundit articles, and CNN had found my email and they reached out. Fox News reached out. My department was getting slammed with phone calls and emails, and people were actually writing handwritten letters, most of which were supportive. They were calling in to say, "We love Officer Nate. This is such a great video. Promote him," and all these things. Just ton of praise. And there were the occasional haters and critics that had written in to fire me and charge me with a crime, whatever crime they thought I could be charged with. So it was going nuts, and it was a very surreal feeling, having that many people see me online, see me on the news. I mean, I was getting messages and phone calls and letters coming in from Ireland and the UK and Australia and Canada and Mexico, all over the place. And it took me a while for that to really sink in, the kind of chord that had struck on both sides, right? A good chord and a bad chord, with the right and with the left, because we were so divided, and we still are. But back then it was a little more prevalent, it seemed. So like I told you before, Blaine County, Idaho it's a blue county in a very red state. You got a lot of people. So Sun Valley Resort is in that area, and you have a lot of people from California who own properties up there that vacation there in the winter. And so it's a very liberal area. And the mayor and the city council, all Democrats, and they hated the fact that that video got so much attention, and they wanted to fire me immediately. But my marshal went to bat for me, and she said, well, no, that's just silly. This is a TikTok video. He didn't, intend for this to go viral the way that it did. She's like, I'll give him a verbal warning. And they're like, no, that's not good enough. We need some sort of, more strict punishment here. So they agreed that they would suspend me for a week without pay. And this was in like the beginning of May of 2021. Mm-hmm. So my buddy down in Utah started a GoFundMe campaign because he wanted to help me recover the wages that I was going to lose for that week. And he set the goal initially at like $10,000, thinking that, this is kind of a lofty goal, but maybe we'll get a few donations, maybe a couple $100 will come in to help you pay your bills that week. And I thought, well, that's great. Appreciate it. Even if we don't get any donations, it was a nice gesture. Well, so I get off the phone with him after he makes this GoFundMe campaign active, And a couple hours later, I get a phone call from one of my supervisors asking me if I knew about this GoFundMe thing. And I said, yeah, I just got done talking to my buddy about it. He just barely posted it. And he's like, well, you might want to go check it out. And so I hung up, logged into the GoFundMe, and it already collected like 20, 30 grand. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
What? And that was a lot. I was like, what is it? Where'd this money come from? Is this real? And our jaws were just on the floor. So what had happened, I found out, was the Gateway Pundit had done an article about the video, and they had linked the GoFundMe campaign in the article. So millions of people had seen this article and went to donate. And
I can interrupt you for 1 second. I was one of them.
Were you?
I was. I mean, it was only $5, my friend.
Hey,
but
you know what? I appreciate it.
It was just
that actually means a lot.
I remember hearing that a fundraiser was happening. I don't remember. It might have been on TikTok. It was somewhere, and I went and Googled it, and then I found it, and I threw $5 in it because I appreciated what you were doing so much. But you guys ended up raising like $750,000, I think, something like that.
It was a little over $500,000.
$500,000. Okay, I'm a little high then. And then you ended up donating it, right?
I donated a lot of it. I didn't donate all of it, but I donated a lot of it to a few different charities and other GoFundMe campaigns for different officers who, were kind of in hot water with their departments, who had done something similar, or they had been in a use of force that I thought was justified after looking, at the information, but they were getting hamstringed by liberal prosecutors, liberal administrators, and, just the woke crowd in general. And then, after it was all said and done, so what had happened was they ended up firing me. And when they fired me, that made national news as well, because I was already in the spotlight. Donald Trump Jr. actually tweeted out the link to my GoFundMe campaign, and it just, donations skyrocketed at that point. And so, it was the whole thing from start to finish was, like a dream. It was, I couldn't believe it was all happening. It was kind of a whirlwind. I did 40 or 50 interviews between April and August of that year, between national news, local news, radio, podcasts, things like that. So that's kind of the Reader's Digest version of that story.
What's fascinating about it is, like you said, back at that time, 2020, 2021, to be fair, police relations in the public were not the best, right?
Right. Yeah.
Now, I remember at that time, because as we were talking off air, I do a radio show also. And I remember we had one of the local Leos on, and I happened to talk about your video with them.
Okay.
Because I wanted to get their feedback, and more precisely, what we were talking about is what are you seeing from your officers who've seen that video and all that, and they were 100% supportive across all things. And it's interesting to see that the silent majority, and I don't want to get political here because that's not the goal of this podcast, but the silent majority spoke loudly in your particular case, and I'm going to be blunt and say, I think the way you handled it was masterful.
Thank you.
It puts you, here you are. I don't know how small a town you're in, but I'm going to say a small town guy, so to speak. I'm sure you had never been on a national stage before. And then literally overnight, you're this sensation worldwide. As you look back on it now, because you kind of alluded to this earlier, it's changed your life. How when you look back on it now, I'm sensing it's generally a positive thing, but how do you feel about it as you look back on it?
I feel confident that I did the right thing. Again, initially it started out as a satirical video, just throwing my hat in the ring to make fun of LeBron James.
Oh, it's funny as hell too.
Yeah. Thank you. I added the little Michael Jordan is the GOAT bit at the end just to, put an exclamation point on it. But, I never intended for it to have the kind of impact that it did, but once it did, and once I found myself in the national and even the global spotlight, and people were reaching out to me saying, hey, you have a voice and a platform now. Don't let them take that away from you. And I took that to heart. And so that's why I agreed to do all these interviews on, Fox News and Dr. Phil's show last year, because, there's the opposition has such a loud voice, and we need to be even louder if we're gonna, if we're gonna combat all of the woke ideologies that we have to combat. And again, not to get political, but
Right, but I get what you're
uh,
saying.
this is, yeah, that's what we have to do. We just have to yell a little bit louder than they do. And so I took the opportunity and took advantage of the media attention and the interviews that people wanted me to do to express my support for police and my advocacy for police, because they do a hard job and it's underappreciated and underpaid and it's dangerous, and most people don't acknowledge that. And like you pointed out, the relationship between the public and police was just, it's been garbage for the past couple of years, and police officers are vilified at every turn. And it's not fair to them, and they don't have, most police officers don't have a voice. And were it not for all of the support that I got, the GoFundMe money that allowed me to, sort of break the bonds of kind of that, what do I want to call it? So people sort of get, they're bound to their income and their pension, when they're, middle to lower class, and they don't want to make waves because they can't lose their job because they can't afford to, and they need the benefits and things like that. Well, everything that had happened allowed me to not to have to rely on those things, and so I could say what I wanted to say, with impunity, so to speak, and without having to worry about them holding my job over my head, because at that point I didn't need it. And so many other doors were opening up. I mean, like you mentioned before, I was getting job offers from, the sheriff of Pinal County, Mark Lamb, the American sheriff. You're probably familiar with him.
I'm very familiar with him. Yeah, I love watching him. He's great.
Yeah, he's great. He's amazing. And Christy Nome, in South Dakota, she offered me a job. So it sort of liberated me in a sense that I could take advantage of this platform that I'd suddenly been thrown onto. And when people ask me, do you regret it? Would you change anything? And I absolutely would not.
I'm going to ask this question because I have my opinion on it, but do you think that it actually started changing things for the better, in the sense that, knowing the vitriol that was going on at that time, my personal belief is what happened to you opened people's eyes that, for lack of a better term, police officers are human beings, Do you think that that's the case too? Because I genuinely do believe that.
I hope so. And I have been seeing a little bit of that. Whenever I encounter a police officer, whether it's somebody that I've worked with or somebody new that I'm meeting, I try to get a sense from them how things are going in the field, in the law enforcement industry. And I think they're taking a turn for the better. And I've even seen a lot of officers now who are able to make content, in uniform. Some of them even, representing their department in some cases, and there's no, there's no negative consequences. There's no repercussions for that, and I think that's great. As long as they're not doing anything to disparage the badge and waste tax dollars and things like that. But I like seeing police officers be able to express their opinions, especially about matters of public interest, without there being blowback, at least for them personally. So I think you're right. I think we are kind of seeing an uptick in that, and I hope it continues, because, I mean, police officers can impart a lot of wisdom just because of the things that they see on a daily basis, the people that they deal with, the problems that they have to solve on a daily basis. So, I think they have a lot of valuable things to say, and, for them to be censored and silenced, I think is a travesty.
Yeah, it's funny because when you talk to policymakers, politicians and all that, they don't listen to police officers. They don't talk to them. They may talk to the upper levels, possibly a sheriff or a chief of police, depending on what it is, but they don't talk to the boots on the ground, if you will. They have no idea. And I'm not trying to disparage a sheriff or a chief of police, but they're not out on the streets anymore. They're sitting in an office. And, things have changed drastically. Now, I have full disclosure, half my family were police officers growing up. How I didn't become one is a mystery to this day. Half were police officers, a few were firemen. I went completely away from both. And I regret it.
Oh, do you? I was going to say, you were the smart one.
No, I wish I'd be retired with a full pension. Like my one cousin retired 10 years ago with full pension and all that after, I
Hmm.
think 28 years, whatever it was. But
Okay.
it's interesting that you kind of talk about other police officers. I saw an uptick also on the various social medias with officers making videos. There was one guy, I forget
Hmm.
his name, he was in Rhode Island, who I thought was fantastic because people would
Hmm.
ask him questions like, well, how far over the speed limit do I have to go before you're going to pull me over and all that. And
Yeah.
he was brilliant in the way he was handling it, you know.
Hmm.
And again, it humanizes the police.
Yep.
One thing, again, I don't want to get political on it, but one thing I can't stand is people don't see police officers as human beings.
Hmm.
Um, I would argue it is the toughest job there is. I really, again, disclosure, family members, right? But
Yeah.
knowing what you guys have to deal with, people don't understand. I say to people, do you understand that when you join and you go on a force, you're not working 8 to 5. You're generally working the midnight shift for the first few years.
Yep.
Holidays, no such thing, and
Right.
all that.
Right.
And people don't understand it. And you get paid a pittance for
Hmm.
literally putting your life on the line. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I think you do also. And the other side of that too is you also call out situations that you don't think are appropriate because you've done
Right.
videos where
Yeah.
on certain things that have made the news, and you aren't afraid to call it out, and I applaud you for that. What's been the blowback, if you will, or feedback, whatever way you want to put it, on when you've done that?
I haven't had a lot of blowback when I do those types of videos because the sad part is that most people, especially on TikTok, think that cops are in the wrong most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I do a video like that, they're like, "Yeah, right on. We've been saying this all along." I'm like, "No, you don't get it." Like, they think cops are wrong anyway. And so they don't think that they think I'm being disingenuous because I don't call out cops every time they use force or every time those people think cops are not justified, with whatever enforcement action they took. I should jump on that and make a video condemning the police officers. The fact of the matter is that most police officers do their jobs correctly and within the bounds of the law without violating people's rights. It's, we see the very small fraction of incidents where police officers messed up, and those videos blow up because it's sensational, it's controversial. That's what people thrive on.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't have a problem. I like to think that my platform and the content that I make is about accountability, whether it's law enforcement related, whether it's dating, relationships, and marriage, whether it's nutrition, dieting, fitness. Accountability is key, and that's something that as a country we've really lost sight of because nobody is accountable for anything anymore. Um, and they've found ways to just shirk accountability for whatever poor decision they're making. So that's where I try to bring it back around in my content. And yes, if a police officer has messed up, they're negligent, they're reckless, or if it's intentional, whatever the case is, then yes, I will point that out because police officers are or should be held to account for their poor behavior, just like anybody else.
There's good police officers, there's bad police officers. There's good, fill in whatever profession you want, and there's bad.
Right.
There always is. But it is a minuscule number, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as you said, where I am in North Carolina, there was an incident just last night. It became
Mhm.
news where, looking at the video, the officer's probably in the wrong. I'm waiting to see
Mhm.
what the full data is before I would say
Yeah.
anything. But, it bothers me because that is all splashed all over the news already, but we're not getting the full context. And that's what I always tell people is give it a few days. Let's hear the
Yeah.
full side. Now, if that officer's in the wrong, I'll be the first to condemn him, and I know you will
Sure.
as well. So
Yeah.
time will
Absolutely.
tell on that. But you kind of went into where I wanted to go next, which is your TikTok. And the reason I want to talk about it is for the exact thing that you talked about, is that you have a pretty broad spectrum of things that you cover, but in general, to use your words, accountability is what you focus
Mhm.
on.
Yeah.
So, when you look at things like dating, because my niche is talking with men,
Yeah.
voicing for men and all that. And you kind of fall in that, but you also talk about the other side as well. You do similar videos that I do. I call mine give and takes, where you take another video and you kind of do a response to it. How
Right.
how did you get into that from what you were doing? I'm
Yeah.
I'm genuinely curious because it kind of I saw it morph over time, right? And I'm
Hmm.
like, well, crap. Now he's getting in my lane, which is fine. I want that. I want you in that,
Yeah.
and I welcome it, by the way. But how did
Yeah.
you kind of morph over to that?
I think so. There's two pieces to that. Is one is that that topic has become very trendy. The red pill thing and dating
Hmm.
and relationships, and how feminism plays a role in that. But the most important reason is because I believe that most of the problems that we see in our society could be solved if we had stronger families,
Hmm.
right? Mothers and fathers raising kids to be pro-social, productive, competent, accountable members of society. But that's breaking down, and we need men and women dating with the intent to get married and have children in order to remedy that. And so that's why I initially started talking about or discussing this dynamic between men and women in the dating world. Plus I'm single, so I'm out there in the dating world, and I experience a lot of these issues firsthand. And when I see a video, whether it's from a man or a woman, on TikTok with some sort of complaint, or they're lamenting the dating process, or whatever it is, then it kind of hits home. And so I have more to add to that. Most of my videos with regards to dating and marriage usually are in the form of, like you said, a give and take. So it's like a stitch, or it's a response to a comment,
Hmm.
or something like that. Because I see people just, and I'm not an expert, but I see people getting it wrong a lot. And I think we need to get to a point where men and women, because it starts with dating, right? Dating and courtship, that will eventually lead to marriage, or it's supposed to. We've kind of gotten away from that traditional sense of dating and courting. But it we've Kevin Samuels said this in one of his shows, is that men and women are coming into the dating scene and they're confronting each other like enemy combatants. Like,
Hmm.
how do we ever expect it to work? So we have to get to a point where people are a little less selfish, a little less guarded. Which, that I know that's hard for people, because especially when you're in your 30s and 40s and you've been through relationships and experienced heartbreak and things like that, it's really hard to not put up a wall. But if you're out there with the intention of finding a mate, a wife or a husband, you can't approach it from the standpoint of, this person is out to get me. I'm still going to date them, and see
Hmm.
what I can get out of this. But I'm going to put in very little effort and express very little interest until I feel like I have control over this situation. And people they're approaching dating completely wrong.
Yeah, it's funny because I talk about that stuff as well, and
Hmm.
a lot of times people miss it, but I use exaggeration to make my points. Like
Hmm.
I'll throw out the "it's all women till it's no women," which I don't
Right.
believe for a second,
Right.
but it's to counter the "it's all men" and the
Hmm.
absurdity of that whole thing. And I love that they'll come back at me going, "It's not all women. That's not fair." And I'm like, but you've been saying it's all men for 5 decades now.
Yeah.
I think I agree with you in that sense that dating is and relationships are broken, and it is affecting this country. Um, you know, I work with a lot of younger guys in their 20s and all that, and I'd
Hmm.
say to them, and people they miss this too about me, is I'm not against relationships. I'm not against marriage. I'm very much for them. But
Yeah.
guys don't go into it with their eyes open.
Right.
I think, and I want to get your opinion on this. I think they're still living in that, wonderland that, well, if I just treat her right, she's going to treat me right, and I'll never have to worry. And then they get blindsided.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree. And, I've heard this said a lot recently with regard to, the relationship between men and women in general. Women are taught what to expect from men, but not how to treat them. And
Hmm.
men are taught the inverse, right? They're taught how to treat women, but not what to expect from them. So, like you said, they go in with the mindset of, if I give her this, if I give, then everything will be okay, and we'll live happily ever after. And that's rarely the case unless she's been taught to, reciprocate the effort. But that doesn't seem to be the case, like you said, over the last few decades, and feminism plays a big role in this. More women are taking on a more masculine role and not realizing that that's not attractive to men. Men don't want a masculine woman. So yeah, we need to figure out how to turn that around somehow and sort of repair the damage that feminism has done to the female psyche, but also to dating and relationships and marriage in general. But no, I agree.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about how men don't want masculine women, and people will get upset by that, right? I can hear them
Mhm.
already going, "Oh, I'm going to get them," right? The other side is true also.
Yeah.
Women don't like men with more feminine traits. And I'm
Yeah.
not knocking those men in any way, shape, or form any more
Mhm.
than I am women who are masculine. If you choose to be that way or you are that way, however you want to put it, more power
Mhm.
to you. I have no problem with
Yeah.
it. But you can't fault others for not being attracted to it. And it goes both ways. That's the point I think both of us try and make is that
Mhm.
these scenarios, they're 50-50, however you want
Yeah.
to put it. And it's interesting because, older guys like me, not so older guys like you, we're trying to, you're a little bit
I'm getting
behind me.
there.
You're getting there
I'm
though.
getting there.
But we're trying to educate.
Yeah.
You talk about women, how what women were taught and what men are taught. How do you think we move forward with that? How do we change it? I'd be curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think, like you with your platform where you're talking to younger men, because we're set in our ways, right? Like we're not changing. Like at
Mm-hmm.
our age, we are who we are. But if you can reach a younger demographic, men and women both, and teach them properly, what to expect from a partner, but also what you need to give in return to a partner and how to treat that person and, how to identify, similar core values, because I think that's where a lot of people go wrong as well. And I see this especially with women, and not to just knock women, because I know that a lot of people think that that's what I'm here to do, especially on TikTok, is that I'm just attacking women, but that's not the case. But women want to feel in love, and they want to feel that limerence and infatuation
Mm-hmm.
with a man. But sometimes they forget about, okay, do our values align? How do we have the same views on raising a family? Do we have the same religious backgrounds and views about religion, things like that? They don't. They tend to sort of dismiss those things as long as that the butterflies are there and the honeymoon phase is still in effect. Then everything else kind of goes by the wayside. But then, that limerence and infatuation and that in love feeling is very fickle, and it wanes over time. It only takes it a few months to go away. And then once that's gone, if you haven't built something real and something solid, if you haven't established that foundation, then the relationship is pretty much done. And so, I think I mentioned this in one of my recent TikTok videos, is that's why you have people who are serial daters, is because they're chasing that infatuation like a
Mm-hmm.
drug. And so, they're in a relationship for 3 months, and then, reality starts to set in. And so they ditch that relationship, and then it's on to the next one. But I don't think people are realizing just how much sacrifice and compromise and work it takes to make a marriage work, especially if you're going to raise children together.
It's funny the things that you said and we're applying to women is we both would agree with this. They apply to men too, right? They're
Right.
chasing the infatuation or the I call it the dopamine hit. That's my thing with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And it if nothing else, if somebody's watching this who's younger, realize what Nate just said. It's work, and
Mm-hmm.
you want it to be work. That's
Yeah.
that's what makes a good relationship. When it's perfect, there's something wrong. I always say that if you
Yeah.
don't have to put in an effort, something is wrong somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't know what it might be because it varies,
Yeah.
but the reality is that something ain't right. You should have to put in some work and some effort on both sides. So,
Yeah.
but it's just interesting because you talk about that a lot. What has been the feedback you've gotten? I want to see if it's similar to mine. I already know the answer, but
Yeah. Well, I'm sure. Yeah. So men, for the most part, agree with the things that I say. They're very much like, yeah, right on. That's exactly, you said what we're all thinking. And with women, it's actually been a bit of a mixed review. I have a lot of female followers, and, a lot of them agree. And some of them have been bold enough to contact me and say, hey, that kind of hit home, but I don't think that applies, to most women. And that's a caveat, right? Like, of course there's always exceptions,
Hmm.
and there's never an absolute when it comes to this kind of stuff. And then of course I've got the women who are a little more liberal on the feminist side who just come after me hardcore in the comment section, and some of them will stitch my videos and report my videos and try to get them taken down. But men for the most part tend to agree. Women, it's about 50-50, it seems like.
It's funny because I have the exact same experience, right? I don't. My followers is probably about 15% female, but
Hmm.
there isn't a day that goes by I don't get DMs from them going, you know what you said is, like you said, hits home,
Yeah.
and variation, and they're like, thank you for saying it, or geez, I never
Hmm.
thought of that. All variations of that, and then there's the other side. So, and that's
Yeah.
where I want to kind of go. You're it's almost like
Yeah.
we planned this, but we didn't, which is
Right.
to talk about how the response from the feminists, because I deal with the same
Hmm.
thing, and getting your accounts banned in some cases, taken down.
Hmm.
You've had them go and come back. If I know I've had 3 accounts banned.
Yeah.
Actually it was 4, but one magically came back out of nowhere. To this day, I
Huh.
still don't know. I have Men Need to Be Heard 3 as my main, but I had 2
Okay.
TOO. It was taken down Christmas Eve last year.
Oh, geez.
And then it just suddenly popped up again in April. And I
That's
knew it as one of my
strange.
followers went, this account's still up there. And I'm like, so I don't know what happened. But anyway, can you kind of talk about what you go through, the experiences of dealing with those when they report you and all that? Because I don't think a lot of people really understand it.
Well, so I'm on my 7th account now,
7th. Oh,
and
you got me beat, my friend.
well, and I wish my first account would magically come back because I had about 600,000 followers when it got banned, and it got banned on the 4th of July of 2021, which just so ironic that that's the date that they would choose to actually ban my account permanently. Um, Yeah, it's just I think the truth has a way of exposing our flaws, and a lot of people hate that. A lot of people
Hmm.
can't stand to be confronted with the truth about just how bad they are. And I'm not trying to say that they're just awful, horrible, bad people, but people who are willing to improve themselves, are willing to confront their flaws and be open to criticism and hear things that are tough to hear so that they can make changes, right? But there's that side who just cannot stand that. That's like kryptonite to them.
Hmm.
And when you make a video, especially about so sort of advocating for traditional values when it comes to dating and the traditional gender roles and things like that, those feminists and those liberals on the left, just they can't stand that. They hate it. They think it's bigoted. They think it's toxic.
Hmm.
That's another term you hear all the time, is toxic masculinity. It's so ridiculous. But they will come after you with tenacity, and in the comment section, and then they'll make a video about you, and if they have a large enough following, suddenly you start to see just an influx of comments of people insulting you and
Hmm.
attacking your character, attacking you personally, which is when you've won, right? When they
Exactly.
start insulting you,
Exactly.
because
Yeah.
if they can't have a civil conversation back and forth and present an argument that has some substance, you've won that. So it's it's kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's like, oh my god, here they come again, but then I kind of chuckle a little bit when they do that, because it's like, okay, I got under their skin with truth and with facts and
Hmm.
reality and logic.
And that's a key point, right? If you are watching a video or reading something and it doesn't affect you, then there's not a reason to be engaged in it. If it's affecting
Mhm.
you, there's a reason. You should explore that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. We both know
Right.
that.
Yeah.
I hate banning. I despise it. I have
Yeah.
never. I have reported, I think, 2 or 3 videos at this point, only
Hmm.
because they were outright calling for physical harm to someone. Right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
my only exception. You
Yeah.
want to hurl names, insults, whatever, that there should be no banning. I'm actually not surprised you got banned on July 4th, because one of the things they do is they do mass reporting attacks, and they love holidays for it because
Mm.
they know you're not watching to defend it, right?
Yeah.
That's why they got me on Christmas Eve.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a very common thing they'll do, because what most people don't realize is they have their little groups. I've actually infiltrated one,
Oh.
where
Okay.
they use Quora. There's the other one they use. They have their private group. Facebook's another one they'll use. And then they'll
Okay.
say, all right, we're going to get Nate or we're going to get Dan. Two
Yeah.
o'clock. And it's always during the night, if you notice.
Right.
And they love holidays, you know. But
Yeah.
the point to make for the audience watching this is understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to ban, in our case, talking about issues related to society for Nate, men for me, but a little mix of both for both of us.
Yeah.
And that's not a good thing for society or for
Mhm.
anyone because if we can't have discussions, all is lost. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole, the whole point of the First Amendment and free speech. If we can't have a free marketplace of ideas and opinions, then we just become stagnant. And well, and not just that, but we actually fall apart, right? Because, if we're not improving, if we're not evolving, we're devolving, essentially. But yeah, but you know, if someone has an ideology that they're pushing, a narrative that they're pushing, and it can't withstand the scrutiny or it can't withstand scrutiny and questioning and being weighed against the truth, it's not right. But people would rather be right than be better, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense,
That makes
right?
total sense. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they don't, yeah, the censorship is dangerous. That's one of the things that we talked about on Dr. Phil's show last year was, the censorship of just ordinary people like you and me on TikTok. It's like, what is the point? We can't be free to express our opinions, just because someone might find them offensive or unsavory. Like if that's the standard by which you judge, how valuable speech is or an opinion, nobody will be able to say anything at some point in the future, because everybody's going to be offended by something, no matter how innocuous or anodyne it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree, we need to be able to exchange ideas and information. Give us as much information. I know that some people are reckless and irresponsible with all of the information, but those of us that are mature adults and we think logically and pragmatically about things most of the time, we can handle it. Give us the information. Let us be informed. We can make the decision ourselves.
Amen to that. All right, I want to shift the conversation, if I may, because I want to
Yeah.
take advantage of your expertise and past as a law enforcement officer. So,
Oh, you bet.
one of the things that I hear from my followers, and I've covered this extensively recently, is false allegations. Primarily, what I want to talk with you about is domestic violence
Hmm.
and having to evict a guy from a house because depending what you call it, a TRO, PFO,
Yeah.
all whatever, there's all different terminologies. What I
Hmm.
want to do is because you are a law, well, I'm going to say we're a law enforcement officer.
Hmm.
I I've given the perspective before, but it's more appropriate that you do. So,
Okay.
I actually train a law enforcement officer. She's a sheriff's deputy, and she's the one they send to serve these because her words, not mine. She's a woman,
Okay.
and they want her going with the male officer to protect the woman, and the male officers, they separate them when they go to serve and all that stuff.
Okay.
Would be like, TRO's been issued, get him out of the house type scenario.
Yeah.
Um, in general, though, because you always hear that police officers, the call they hate the most is domestic violence one. Is that in fact true?
Yeah, it is because of how it's never black and white, right? It's not
Right.
like you'll get in most domestic violence calls usually end up non-violent, if that's if that makes sense. Usually it's them arguing. There's maybe a threat of violence, but when we show up to a call where husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend were arguing about whatever, and it got to the point where it was so loud that it was disturbing the neighbors, we show up, and unless a crime has been committed, there's nothing that we can do. We can encourage one party or the other to leave,
Mm-hmm.
for the night, get a hotel, go stay with a friend or a family member or whatever. But most of the time, we usually end up sort of refereeing an argument to help them, come to some sort of resolution so that we don't have to keep coming back throughout the night because they won't quit arguing or, and we can't take both of them to jail, again, unless we have a crime that we can charge them with. But as far as domestics where there was violence, someone did perpetrate violence on the other, there's still sort of very complex situations to deal with, because in Idaho, for example, the domestic violence statute, there's an element in there about who the predominant aggressor is, not the primary aggressor, but the predominant aggressor, which, this, again, not to attack women, but I think the statute was written with that particular language in order to absolve women from accountability, because in a lot of domestic violence situations, women are the primary aggressor. Sometimes they're the only aggressor. But because, there's a male in the house who's bigger, stronger, more powerful, then there's the woman is looked on with, compassion and leniency when it comes to that sort of thing. And if a man defends himself, and ends up giving her a black eye or a bloody nose or, a sprained wrist in the process, then, by definition, he's the predominant aggressor per that particular statute and can be charged with domestic battery. And I think that's incredibly, it's just not right. It's not just, I don't think that statutes like that are lawful.
I'm kind of smiling in the background here because what you just described is called the Duluth model, which is assume the larger person. I'm paraphrasing it, but the larger person is the aggressor. That's right. And it sounds like the statute in Idaho is it is in Iowa too, by the way, is primarily along those. That's why I know about it, because I actually had someone on the podcast not too long ago. We had that exact conversation.
Okay.
I want to get the police perspective on that. So, and you're kind of giving us a hint to it. You go to a call, either it's mutual or it's pretty obvious she's the aggressor or has committed not a crime potentially, but she's the one committing the violence.
Yeah.
You're in a no-win situation there. And this is something I want you to kind of talk about, because people don't understand that, Nate, right? They're like, well, why don't the police just tell her to leave? Or why don't they tell them both, all that stuff that we're talking about. You're in a difficult position because you're showing up. You have no idea what's going on, really. You're trying to make your best judgment. What can you do, knowing the statute being the way it is, other than what you've described? I mean, what I want to get to is, how do you feel as a police officer and a human being when you see that situation?
It's funny that you worded the question that way, because I think what police officers have to do is disregard the way they feel. So perfect example, the very last domestic violence call that I responded to as a police officer was husband and wife. She was accusing the husband of attempting to strangle her, right? Like, she also said that he kicked her in the chest and then got on top of her and began to strangle her. And when I talked to him, he's got scratches and cuts and bruises all over his face and his neck. And he doesn't have any marks on his hands or his arms, and she doesn't have any marks anywhere on her body. No bruising around the neck, no bruising where she said that he kicked her, no injuries. And I'm thinking, okay, there's something not right about what she's telling me. And so the story that I got from him was that he was cheating. She found out, and so she went ape shit on him, started hitting, scratching, biting, clawing, and the only thing he did was just kind of push her away and keep her away until I think one of their kids actually called the police, which is sad because, the kids were so young. I remember the kids being there. And so in situations like that, where you have a female who is playing the victim and she's crying and she's pleading with you, he's dangerous. He tried to kill me. And, part of, the feeling part of you, right? The emotional side of you wants to agree with her and believe her. But I had to look at the evidence and listen to his side of the story versus her side of the story and see which one was more compatible with the physical evidence. And it was clear to me that he was telling the truth and she wasn't. So I took her to jail and charged her with domestic battery. And I think some of the female officers that were on scene kind of gave me the side eye a little bit. But in order for us to get around these statutes that are written to the advantage of women and just, to the total, disadvantage and injustice when it comes to the way we treat men. I mean, look at things logically, look at the evidence, be pragmatic about it, and rational about it, and try to think through it rather than feel your way through it. That's one way.
Hmm.
And it's I don't, it might be the only way, might be, as far as police officers are concerned, and the actions that they can take.
Well, it should be the actions they take. Wouldn't you agree that they do
Yeah.
need to divest their emotions from it? I'm just
Hmm.
curious, and I don't want to knock officers or female officers in any way, but you said they kind of gave you the side eye. Did
Yeah.
they? I assume they saw the same thing you did. How did they
I
not recognize it like you did? I'm
They,
just
and
curious.
maybe it was they saw some of the things I did, but they didn't see all of the
Oh,
things.
okay,
So
okay.
usually the way it works in a domestic violence situation is you separate the parties and take them into completely separate rooms so that they can't influence each other's answers when you're asking them questions. They can't intimidate one another or threaten one another. So she was in the bedroom and he was out in the kitchen. And so I was basically going back and forth between the two
Hmm.
while we had male officers sitting with the male and we had female officers sitting with the female. So they heard her side of the story, but not necessarily his side of the story. And they didn't see up close the injuries that he had. I mean, she did some work on this guy's face, and I understand why she did it. It doesn't make it right. I mean, yeah, I don't condone cheating, especially when you're married.
Right.
But at the end, she committed a crime and he didn't. So I think that's why they were kind of like, well, really, is this what you're gonna, because they sit there and they listen to her sob story, about how, oh my God, he tried to strangle me. And she was flat out lying because there weren't any marks, there weren't any injuries. And even if he had done something, even if he had put his hands around her and tried to strangle her, there wasn't any evidence that I could support charging this guy.
Hmm.
But there was plenty of evidence to support charging her. And even if the prosecutors didn't want to necessarily go forward with prosecuting her for domestic violence, it got her out of the house right that night.
Hmm.
She spent the night in jail. I did my due diligence and I acted in good faith. Um, and again, like I said, even if she doesn't end up with an actual charge, I did what I could that day to make sure that there, was no further violence enacted upon either party. So,
Yeah, it's interesting because, and you probably don't know this, or you may know this about me, but I am a victim of domestic violence. So
mm,
there was an incident where she knocked me out cold. All right, I'm
wow,
like out. She hit me with a golf club, knocked me out cold.
geez,
Our neighbors heard the whole thing, called the police. Police
uh
show up, and long story short, it was obvious I was not the aggressor.
huh, right,
But then it was, well, we're not going to take a report. You need to leave. They never. This is in 1994, five, somewhere in there.
wow,
I don't even remember anymore. No report was ever taken. It shows nowhere. Um, there were a couple of officers there. The one, I could tell he didn't want to be there. I could, he's doing this. He's looking around. He's like doing everything he
mm,
can. He does not want to be in the middle. He was young. He looked like a kid to me. So
yeah,
maybe I don't know how new he was on the force. But the other one was adamant. Well, if anything, I'm going to charge you and arrest you. And he was going to, until my neighbors got involved. They come over and like, look, he did nothing. We heard the whole thing and all that.
yeah,
Long story short, I started doing investigations into all that, and I actually got involved as a domestic violence peer counselor for men. And the one thing
okay,
I saw and I was at was trainings for police officers. This is where I want to go with that is, so they were trained back then. This is in the late 90s under the Duluth model. That primary aggressor, assume, is the bigger
mhm,
person, no matter what you say.
yeah,
Is how you were on the force? You said, I think you said 13 years. So you
mhm,
started in late
yeah,
2000s, give or take.
yeah, 2006.
What was the training then? Was it similar or had it changed to what I saw? Because they basically were telling them without saying it overtly, arrest the man.
They never came out and said that directly. But so when I started at the academy, they were teaching the primary aggressor is the one, that you typically charge. But it wasn't until, I want to say 5 or 6 years later, we had a mandatory training with, people from the state who came in, and that's when the statute had been changed. So it must have been like around 2011, 2012, something like that, when it changed in Idaho. The language changed from primary to predominant.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they still had the definitions of primary and predominant there together in the same statute, but it was the predominant aggressor that you took enforcement action against. And, I can't help but think that the reason, I mean, they had people from the state going around to every agency in the state of Idaho to give them this training and
Yep.
basically tell officers, yeah, this is who you're arresting now, quote unquote. This is who we go after.
And that's why I wanted to bring it up and have you talk about it, because I've talked about it before, and they look at me like I'm blue in the face. What do you mean that's what
Mhm.
they teach them? Well, that is, and it's exactly the scenario you talk about, right?
Yeah.
I can't speak for your particular situation, but the majority of the time it's domestic violence shelter personnel working
Hmm.
with the state, either
Yeah.
directly or contract, that are going around doing these trainings.
Hmm.
And again, I'm trying to help people understand what you, as a law enforcement officer, one, what you're trained, what the statutes are, and the reason you respond the way you do. Because I hear from guys all the time, like literally hourly in many days, how the police have shown up and they assumed I was the aggressor, or they were going to arrest me. You hear it over and over and over again. And I'm not trying to defend anyone's position on that, but I want people to understand that this is why that may seem that way. It's not always that way, right? I
Yeah.
I don't like that people put the blame per se on the police, because they're doing what they've been trained to do. And oh, by the
Hmm.
way, in some cases, what the higher ups are telling them to do. I don't know if you
Right.
experienced that at all.
Well, I did, and I was actually commissioned by my chief at one point. So I was a detective for about 6 years with the Twin Falls Police Department, and I investigated a lot of sex crimes. And my chief wanted me to put together a training to teach our patrolmen and some of our other detectives how to investigate sexual assault cases. How to preserve the evidence, what kind of questions to ask, and things like that. And he told me that he wanted me to come at it from a standpoint of we always believe the victim. And I'm like, wait, no, beliefs are based on feelings, and your feelings are very subjective. And if you come at it from with that kind of mentality, then you've already biased your investigation. You've already biased your the outcome of this case is that you're going to be looking for things that will reaffirm what you already believe, which is
Mhm.
the victim. That's not how we investigate crimes. We come at it objectively, and then we look at all of the evidence. We analyze all of the statements from witnesses, suspects, victims, compare it with the physical evidence, and then see what we have, when it's all said and done. And I thought, this is, and you pointed this out, is that, chiefs and sheriffs, they've been removed from, police work for quite a long time, and they're more influenced by, the political zeitgeist,
Mhm.
than police officers are. So I think, I don't know where I'm assuming that it was handed down to him from the mayor or the city councilor or somebody who wanted police officers trained a certain way when dealing with, sexual assault accusations. And one of the most disturbing things for me during my tenure as a detective, because again, like I said, I investigated sex crimes, and I want to say, and I don't know if we need to use, code words for things like, like if we need to say grape so that your
Yeah,
videos
I
don't get
mean, you
removed.
might as well. We're okay on
Yeah.
YouTube, but you never know.
Yeah. So grape cases, 90 to 95% of the cases like that landed on my desk were completely fabricated. And
Real
not,
that high
yes,
you saw?
yes, yes.
95%. Wow.
95% of the grape cases that I investigated. Now, that's anecdotal. That's my experience. I don't
Mhm.
know what, if there's a national statistic, there probably isn't. Um, and it wasn't because I just chose not to believe the victim. It was because through asking questions and scrutinizing their story and trying to gather, the evidence, told a completely different story. And they eventually ended up confessing to me that they made the story up because it was usually a case of, there was some infidelity, they cheated, their husband found out, and in order to avoid any type of conflict or divorce, they cried grape. And so
Mhm.
they would come in and file a report just to make it look genuine. And at the risk of ruining some poor guy's life who was just out, having a good time, at the bar or wherever it was he met this girl, had consensual sex. And then the next thing you know, his name's on a report for a felony crime. And I went to my supervisors with this. I'm like, what do we do about this? This is insane. This is an insane number of false allegations that have the potential to ruin a man's life. And the answer was, well, we don't want to prosecute those because we don't want legitimate victims to be afraid to report. I'm like, well, so then don't charge legitimate victims with the crime. Like let's investigate every case objectively. And there are things that we can do to reassure legitimate victims, that will take their case seriously. But this is absolutely insane. There's a very small percentage of grape reports that are actually legitimate.
Wow.
And we're okay with men being collateral damage just so that we don't scare away the legitimate victims. No, that did not sit well with me.
It's funny because what your supervisor is telling you is we don't want to scare away the victim, but yet that's exactly what they're doing by denying the man that's falsely accused. He is the victim. Mm-hmm. And,
right.
I've had guys on my podcast and show talking about what it's been like to be falsely accused, completely exonerated, right? Mm-hmm. Have to go through the investigation. In some cases, they were charged, tried, and jailed. Yeah. And literally spent hundreds of thousands of dollars defending themselves, went through hell. And I remember, a couple of times they were saying they could tell the police officers knew they were telling the truth. But still the higher ups were saying, well, we got to err on the side of caution. I'm paraphrasing. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. Now, 95%, you blew me away with that, Nate. I got to be honest with you, because I've talked to local, I don't want to reveal any names or anyone, but I have talked to someone who works in SVU, Special Victims Unit, in my area. Mm-hmm. And he put the number at about 50-50. He said maybe as many as 60 were, he felt, not valid claims. His words, not mine. But it kind of shows, because if you actually, there is some data out there. They always put it at somewhere between 2 and 10%. So here it's contradicting what you hear in the field versus what it is. So when and this is where I'm curious, and maybe you can't speak on this, but if you can. So you go and you find it's a false allegation, or let's be nice, a misunderstanding.
Yeah, right.
Because sometimes you have to code it that way. Nothing's happening to the person making the false allegation. So is that report, what does that report show in the system? It shows he's been potentially arrested or whatever, charged, whatever it might be. That's going to show, because I have had guys, there's one guy I had on last spring, was arrested and completely exonerated afterward. But yet when you Google him, the first thing that comes up is his arrest record, right? The report. Yeah. What happens on the back end? Because this, I think, is very insightful for the audience to understand and may put some perspective on the stats. What happens with those reports when you're done with them and you find, no, it's a false allegation? Do they get tossed, or what do they do?
Well, so if it's just a report, right, there's no criminal charges filed. So we have different case statuses that we could mark depending on whatever the outcome of our investigation was. And a lot of crime reports end up being inactive, meaning you couldn't determine one way or the other whether a crime was actually committed. There's no proof that it did, but you also can't show that it didn't. And then if you can determine that the crime actually did not take place, then it's marked unfounded. And a lot of these, it's interesting that you bring this up, because a lot of these cases that I would investigate that I could prove were fabricated, I would mark as unfounded, so that we could show that this person who is named as a suspect is not guilty of this crime, is exonerated for all intents and purposes. And when I would submit my report with that case status marked as unfounded, they would always send it back to me and say, well, you need to mark this inactive in case there's any other evidence that comes in. I'm like, all the evidence is there that she lied. What are you talking about? And I don't know if that was because, our records supervisor was a female, and that might have had something to do with it, or it might have had something to do, with our administrators, just sort of, I would say, acquiescing to this idea that men are always the bad guy and women are always the victims. But yeah, that was a very frustrating thing for me to investigate those types of crimes.
I hope people just listen very carefully to what Nate was just saying, because that is a key point. So much so that I'm going to probably clip it because it's I'm not going to fault whether it was the female administrator or whatever, because I've heard this from numerous sources, right? And that's why I
Yeah.
wanted you to speak about it. Is that's what happens. The reports, for lack of a better term, disappear. They don't, but you know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
And they never make the statistics that way. So that's why when people will argue to me, well, it only shows 2% of allegations are false. No, because you're not seeing this whole group of data that's out there.
Yeah.
And again, it puts you in a difficult position. And this is what one of the things and the reasons I wanted to have you on is to talk about that law enforcement perspective, that you're trying to do the right thing. But yet, here you go. You find the guy's innocent. You're trying to clear him. If he's been arrested at any point, that arrest record's public record at that point.
Yeah.
It doesn't disappear because you found there was nothing. It's in there, and this guy's life could potentially be ruined forever. I had Jason on. I talked about it just a couple minutes ago. He can't get a job now because the first thing he does when he applies, every HR department does the same thing. They Google your name.
Yep.
It's the very first thing that comes up in Google. He was arrested for battery or whatever it was. And so, again, where I want to go now is as a police officer and as an advocate or someone who wants to talk about accountability, how do we fix that? What do you think from a legal and law enforcement perspective? How do we change that?
I think we need oh man. So I did a podcast, my own podcast with his name is escaping me now. He was a sheriff in Utah and in Arizona for a little while. It'll come to me, but he's actually one of these sheriffs that sued the Clinton administration when they tried to pass the Brady bill. But so one of the biggest points on his platform is that we need administrators who are not afraid to say no to federal funding, right? Because once you get federal funding, that comes with things like higher crime reports, higher statistics, and that kind of ties into the point that you were making. I think is that if we have grape reports and other reports that are listed as unfounded, it means the crime didn't occur. But if we can show that there's an inactive case and it might be able to be solved if we can just get a little bit of help from the federal government, I think that's one of the biggest motivators for administrators is if we can get federal funding, let's pad the stats a little bit in order to do that. And again, that comes at the expense of men most of the time, men who are listed as suspects in these reports, because like you say, these reports end up in a database, or if they're arrested, ends up on their criminal record that can be researched at any time. But we need people in office, right? We need sheriffs who are elected, and then we need people who are elected at a local level who are willing to say no to the federal government. Keep your funding out of here. We don't need it. We don't need you in our business. We'll handle our business as a state. And we'll keep it at the state level. We'll make our own laws. We'll regulate our own, because the federal government, how efficient they are, depending on who's in office and what sort of ideologies are driving policy and legislation during who's ever administration. But I think it's going to take that. It's going to take a pretty dramatic shift in who we elect into office and what sort of stand they're willing to take, and if they can sort of push against the status quo. I think it's gonna take something pretty drastic like that.
Yeah, it's why I always say to people, again, trying to avoid politics not to get too deep into it, but as we're filming this, the recent elections just happened, and it's the municipals, right? And people in my area, one county was about 18% voted. The other one, there's the last number I heard was 11%. Well, that you're voting in our case for mayor, city council, and all that. They're the ones that drive the funds locally. To your point, right?
Yeah.
If we have so much apathy that we don't vote for that, and we don't ask these questions. I do ask them, by the way, on these. Where do you stand on domestic violence? Where I agree with you. That's the grassroots that we need to be starting to do as men, right? Is to say, you know what, we do matter. We are victims as well. This needs to be addressed. What are you going to do on the local level? Because you're right, at the national level, you got red tape, you've got agendas and all that, but the
Yeah.
ones suffering are the men, and in some
Right.
cases the boys. Which kind of I want to kind of shift a little bit again, but kind of keeping the same thing, which is again, as law enforcement officers, you're the ones doing the arresting, right, with
Hmm.
crimes. Everyone always talks about men commit the majority of crimes. I wanted to get your perspective on that. One, is that true, or to what level? Because some people put the number at 85. I've heard 90. I've heard 80. It's somewhere in there, right?
Hmm.
What
Yeah.
do you see on the streets? And again, what do you think we can do to fix that?
Um, it really depends on the type of crime you're talking about. I don't think it's accurate or reliable to say that men commit the majority of crimes. Now, they commit the majority of violent crimes.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it kind of depends on the circumstances. If it's assault and battery, or assault or battery with a deadly weapon, or murder, things like that. But women are more likely to kill children and the elderly. And that's a statistic that's researchable, and fairly consistent, depending on or across different studies. um, but women are also just as likely as men to commit theft or fraud. Actually, in my case, and anecdotally, I've investigated and charged more women for things like embezzlement and counterfeit currency, and credit card fraud, and things like that. So yeah, it's kind of complicated. It's kind of a complicated
Mm-hmm.
question. I don't think we can put I don't think we can put men in that category where they commit the majority of crimes. I don't think that's now the majority of people who end up in prison for the crimes they commit are men. But
Yeah, I was
again, I
trying
think
to
that
separate that. I wanted to talk
okay,
about on the street versus. I was going to go to prison next, right? Which,
sure, yeah,
but I,
but yeah, and I think that's the disparity that we see, is that we see that there's a lot more compassion and empathy, or sympathy rather, for women who commit crimes than there is for men. And I think that leads into your
yeah.
next point about
Well,
the prison population.
yeah, because I think ultimately, and this is where I wanted to go with it, is if you know a woman's committed a crime, and I'm not saying you personally, I'm talking in general as a police officer,
Hmm.
is there more of a likelihood to, for lack of a better term, give her a pass, or at your level, or is it no, we're going to charge on our level, send it to the DA, and then the DA's going, no, we're not going to touch it. I'm curious to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think for police officers, at least in my experience, they didn't discriminate based on gender. If you had the evidence to prove that that a female committed a crime, she was arrested and charged just like any man would be. But yeah, once it gets to the prosecutor level, and even it goes to court in front of a judge or a jury, a jury is more likely to be sympathetic to females. So yeah, but police officers, there's very little discrimination based on gender at the enforcement level. But again, once you get up, to the prosecutor's purview and then into the courtroom, it's a different story.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted you to talk about it is because I've heard that exact same thing from I don't know how
Mhm.
many police officers. Like, oh, I knew it was her, and I charged her and sent it, and it went to the DA, and the DA is like, yeah, I'm not going to bother with that. Or to
Mhm.
your point, it goes to trial. The juries are going to let her off because they're
Yeah.
more sympathetic. Oh, she didn't mean to embezzle $2 million. It just kind of happened,
Right. Yeah.
I know of a case that was exactly that. The woman embezzled
Hmm.
$2 million, and they didn't convict. And dead to rights, they had her.
That's insane.
And
Yeah.
it speaks to, though, why the prison statistics are what they are. And I believe it is
Mhm.
somewhere around 85-15.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to bring out, because I have an expert here who served on the streets for a number of years to talk about the data is there, yes, but there's that underlying data, if you will, under that data that
Mhm.
people aren't seeing. And in general, I think it's safe to say, there's exceptions, of course, that most police officers absolutely do not let gender, and I would argue race, by the way, also.
Oh, for sure.
I
Yeah.
know I'm going to stir it up with that, but um,
Good, as you should.
yeah. But the reality is, you're doing your job, right? It's
Hmm.
as I've said before, it's I think the toughest job to do, because you're
Yeah.
no matter what you do, you're wrong. It does not
Yeah.
matter what you do, you're
Yeah.
wrong. When you see that as a human being now, let's step out of the uniform, but as a
Hmm.
human being now, how does that make you feel? I'm sounding like a shrink now. How does that make you feel? I mean, as you look back, because you're not active law enforcement now, but
Yeah.
mental, what I want to go is mentally, emotionally, is it draining to you to see stuff like that or hear about stuff like that? And, give me your perspective now looking back at it.
I think it causes me to have a lot of sympathy for people who are still doing the job, because their hands are tied in so many ways. I tell this story a lot, or I relate, the difference between, when I started in law enforcement to when I finished. When I started in '06, things weren't this bad. We didn't have woke politicians driving policy that affected, police officers and the way they enforce the law. So we were very proactive. We would go out, we would, find people with dope, find people with warrants, arresting the bad guy for, for lack of a better term. When we, our arrest statistics were really high because we were proactive cops,
Mhm.
out looking for crime, out looking for, people doing what they're not supposed to be doing. Um, but these days, police officers are scared to do that because you find that you could be prosecuted and you can end up in prison for doing the job the way it's supposed to be done. And so you have police officers who are kind of filling a uniform and doing just enough to not get fired, but trying not to do so much that they end up in the spotlight, whether it's at a local or a national level, because you never know what your if your chief, if your department's going to have your back, if the prosecutor's office is going to look at your case objectively, if a jury will look at it objectively, if a judge is going to do the right thing. So I feel like a lot of officers are just kind of like, I'm going to fly under the radar and hope I make it to retirement. And
Hmm.
that's bad.
It doesn't help anybody, right? It
No,
doesn't help the people they're trying to protect. They doesn't help them mentally and emotionally, right? It's
no,
funny when you
not
were
at all.
talking about that. It brought back a story. So going back to the COVID times, in my area they locked us down, right? I owned a gym. We weren't allowed to be open.
Yeah.
I was technically not even allowed to go there, which that wasn't happening, right? I mean, I owned the
Yeah.
business, even though I couldn't have people in, but I
Right.
would go there. Now, the local, I don't want to give names, but the local, let's call it Leo. I said I didn't want to
Uh-huh.
give the department. They used to hide because we were in the back of a strip mall. So he used to hide back there and have their lunch and all that other stuff. So I pull up and he's sitting there like right in front of my door, and I'm like, oh, I'm fucked, right? Because we weren't supposed to be out, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm like, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm good. How are you? I'm like, and we're chit chatting. And next thing I know, I'm like, you want to come in and have a cup of coffee? And then him and I chatted for about an hour. And it was very
Hmm.
similar to the stuff you were talking about, but in relation to COVID. He's like, because I said to him, I said, look, I know I'm not supposed to be there. He goes, I don't care. You,
Yeah.
this is non-issue to me. What we care
Hmm.
about is actual crime.
Right.
And again, I bring that up only in the sense that I want people to understand that you guys are police officers, are not the bad guys, right?
Yeah.
Are there some that
Yeah.
are? Absolutely there are. But
Hmm.
95, 98%, I don't know what the number is, are very good and good at what their job, but they are serving with their hands tied right now, handcuffed, if you
Yeah.
will, and it's
Yeah.
sad because I think it affects everyone. And that's why one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is to kind of bring that forth and get people to talk and listen to what an actual officer had to say.
Yeah.
If you were now talking to someone that was thinking about being a police officer,
Hmm.
what would you tell them? That's a question I've actually asked that every single time I've interviewed someone that was either an officer or a chief or that. What would you tell them? And I love hearing the answers. I pretty much know what you're going to say, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, my answer usually is if you can do anything else, do that.
That's the answer I get from every
Yeah.
one of them.
Yep. It's now, and I'm not out to dash anyone's dreams or aspirations of being a police officer, because I know a lot of people have a passion for it. And if you do, that's great. And if you do and you don't want to do anything else, then yeah, you should do police work. But I actually discuss this in my book. It's in the very first chapter. It's like, if you're on the fence about it at all, if you think it might be a cool job to have, you're not quite sure, but you want to try it out, don't even bother. Go to school, get go to some kind of trade school, welding, plumbing, whatever it is. Do that instead, because it's going to be a lot less stressful. It's going to be a lot better for your personal relationships, whether it's your marriage or your kids or friends. Because the one thing they don't prepare you for in law enforcement is how the job is going to affect your personal life. They don't talk about that ever. I
Hmm.
think maybe I had one class on it in the academy. They called it like emotional survival, for law enforcement. And basically they kind of talked about the importance of maintaining your relationship with your spouse. And, your spouse could come into the class and sit there with you, but it's not talked about nearly enough as it should be. There are, I mean, I got divorced when I was a police officer, and I will freely admit that it was my inability to leave work at work and put my relationship with my ex-wife first that was a big factor
Hmm.
in the reason that we got divorced. And I tell that to everybody that I meet who wants to get into law enforcement. Is like, this job will chew you up and spit you out, and it will give you nothing back. Now, does that mean that nobody should do it? No, we definitely need good men and women out there on the street protecting their communities. But you have to understand that it comes at a price. Now, if you're willing to pay that price and you're prepared for it, and you can prepare for the aftermath,
Hmm.
right? And Leo wives, spouses, they, God bless them, because they're the ones that kind of have to deal with a lot of that blowback as well, and with husbands and wives who come home and they're sullen and withdrawn because they've just been beaten down, during their shift, and they don't want to talk to anybody or interact with anybody. That's hard to do. That's hard to deal with, especially if you're the type of person who really craves that attention and the communication and that intimacy from your partner, and all of a sudden it's just not there. So it takes a it, I wish that there was some way to better mentally and emotionally prepare men and women for police work, but there's nothing like that in place. So that's kind of the warning that I try to give people who want, because they go in with rose colored glasses
Hmm.
on, and they're very bright eyed, and they want to protect and serve, and they want to make a difference, and they want to do good things. But I heard a really good quote about police work, is that, people go into police work wanting to change the world, and they leave having been changed by the world. There's no truer statement.
Wow, that's great. I love that
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
There's no truer statement when it comes to the actual work. So, get counseling as often as possible, even if you don't think you need it. But yeah, I mean, again, we need good men and women wearing the badge. But if you're not preparing yourself for, and I don't even know if there's a way to do that. I honestly don't know if there's a way to mentally and emotionally prepare. But at least go in knowing that you have to prepare somehow.
Hmm.
And once you do the work long enough for a few years and you kind of have an understanding of what that is, then start safeguarding your mental and emotional well-being and your personal relationships, because the police work just isn't as important as your relationship to your wife, to your kids, to your mom and dad, to your friends. It just isn't.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, I ask that question of every police officer I interview and it's uniformly the same thing. Now, the
Yeah.
chief sometime will couch because they're looking to get people in, but they're a little more delicate than you might have been.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I do think that one of the solutions is to offer counseling from day one and have these
Hmm.
honest conversations. The other thing that I always tell people, and I talk to people and say, if you want to know what a police officer does, ask to do a ride along. Most departments will
Yeah.
let you do ride alongs.
Hmm.
I've done them in the past because, as I said, my family was police officers. I used to go a lot. You will get your eyes opened real fast,
For sure. Yeah.
And if you're thinking of becoming a police officer, more power to you. But as I
Hmm.
say to guys with relationships, do it with your eyes wide open. Ask to go on a ride along.
Yeah.
Most departments will do that.
Yep.
And, I remember some of the things I saw. And to your point, the majority of police are men. We know that.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think, I'm going to sound like such a sexist, and I'm going to be, but I think the women get more sympathy as officers off the job than men
Yeah.
do. Men are
Yeah.
expected to button it up,
Hmm.
stoic, and all that, and it eats them alive inside. I think it's fair to say
Yeah.
that.
For
And
sure.
that's one of the things, that's why I ask when I talk with police officers, is to try and humanize you guys, right?
Hmm.
So that people can see that because we all have this notion, because the media is created, that all cops are bad guys. No, you're not. The majority of them are beyond good guys that are dedicating their lives, sacrificing nonstop, right?
Yeah.
And potentially
Yeah.
could be physically harmed or killed.
Mhm.
And I appreciate you for sharing that, because we can't survive as a society without good men and women protecting us, right?
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise, we have anarchy, and we see how that's working in a few cities right now.
God.
It's crazy, but
It's
all right.
almost like we told them this wasn't going to work, but they did it anyway.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's like I just sit back and go, what were they thinking? So anyway, got a couple minutes. So I want to close it down, Nate, by letting you have the opportunity to kind of tell people how they can follow you, the various places. You touched on it earlier, but where can they follow you? And I'm going to say up front, you better be following them, because you're missing out if you're not, but go ahead.
I appreciate it. So first of all, you can find me on my website. It's bluelivesfoundation.org. You can actually purchase a copy of my book there if you'd like. On TikTok, I'm, gosh, what is it now? I think it's the Officer Nate, or Officer Nate 1.3, I think.
I don't know, and
think
I'll put it in the show notes. I'll put links to all of it. Yeah.
I mean, if you search Officer Nate, you should be able to find my current account, but I think it's 1.3. On Instagram, it's the Officer Nate, all one word. Facebook, it's Officer Nate. YouTube, it's Officer Nate. So pretty consistent across the platforms, but yeah.
And you have your podcast also, right? And that's on.
Oh yeah, the Officer Nate podcast. You can find it on Apple and Spotify and pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Yeah, so go check those all out. Nate, I want to say thank you for coming on. Any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
I was thinking about this because I was thinking about your content and kind of what your focus is, and how men and women are just so at odds with each other lately. Whenever you bring up men's issues, right, the conversation tends to get steered back around to, well, what about women? And since we've gone over everything that we've gone over, we've talked about a lot of men's issues today. And caring about men's issues doesn't mean that you can't care about women's issues at the same time. But it seems to be that mindset where if we focus on men's issues, even for a moment, that must mean we don't care about women. And, we're not focused on them for 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And men's and women's issues are equally important. So, I guess I just encourage, especially if you have any female listeners, younger female listeners, because I don't think this is an issue with men, and I could be wrong. But to care about men's issues doesn't mean that, the importance of women's issues, is diminished at all.
Yeah, well, it's a cornerstone of feminism to make it a zero-sum game. If you ever address a man's issue in any way, whether it's talking about it monetarily, whatever, they couch it and they truly believe that you're taking away from women. And the reality is, if we don't address men's issues, we're actually harming women, right?
Yeah.
If you have husband, father, brother, whatever, who unalives himself, the woman's affected just as much. Yeah. So, we have to do I agree 100% with you. We need to do away with that mentality that, it's not a zero-sum game. It's about helping everyone in the end. So,
yes.
On that note, Nate, I want to say thank you. Again, this has been an honor for me. Like I said, I followed you since COVID times, whatever year.
Yeah.
The years have flown by. I can't believe 2024 is just around the corner.
I know. It's insane.
And I want to say thank you to you on many levels. First of all, for your service as a law enforcement officer, but really for what you're doing now, every bit as much, maybe even more so, because you're educating people in many ways, right? And I think leading the way, I genuinely mean this, in showing that, one, police officers are human, but two, that it's not about demeaning anyone. The content you put out is to try and help everyone. Yeah. And some people don't take it that way. I get that.
No.
We both, and I deal with the same thing, but I truly appreciate what you do. And I really encourage people to follow you, because if you go into it with an open mind, an open eye, you can kind of see what you're saying and how it helps everyone. So I just wanted to give you my personal thanks for all that you've done. And hey, go buy the book. I'll put a link to that down below too.
Yeah, I'll make sure I send you all the appropriate.
Send me all the
links.
good stuff. Yeah,
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, Dan. I'm glad that we connected. And thank you for what you do as well. It's very important.
Well, thank you. All right, on that note, I'm going to go ahead and close things down. Hey, if you've watched this far, give me that thumbs up. I got to move the camera. All right. And make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. I do the podcast. It goes out weekly. It comes up Sundays at 11 Eastern. I'm also live on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, and maybe a few other places in the near future. Wednesdays from 4 to 5:30. Sometimes I do open chats. Sometimes I do discussions on specific topics. Come join me live. Be part of that conversation. And hey, keep coming back because I have a lot of interesting guests lined up already. It's going to be I'm really looking forward to 2024 because I've got some big hitters coming on, and I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Men Need to Be Heard.